Hello there. I am glad you're here today. I have a hint at what we're going to be talking about today, and it looks a little bit like this. Now, what we have been doing up until now is talking about the stories from the Bible, and most recently in the New Testament, with what was going on with Jesus being born and his life, his death, his resurrection, and then what happened with the church after that. So we got along a good way into the early history of the church, but it seems at that point, when we get to the end of the book of Acts, we are done with the history of the church as far as it being written down. What we have after this makes up most of the New Testament. Now, there are 27 books in the New Testament, 21 of them are letters that are written, and that's about as far as I can go with that because we know that Paul wrote 13 of the letters, and then the other letters were written by John and Peter, who were two of the apostles. Um, James wrote one. Jude wrote one. Now, James and Jude were Jesus's brothers. And then there is one book. We don't know who wrote it. It's one of the most important books. But the fact that we don't know it tells us something that is important in itself, in that it's not so much who wrote the letters, but what was written. Uh, when we look at books of the Bible, when we determine whether or not we're going to pay attention to them, one of the first questions is to say, is it inspired? Meaning, did God direct this to be written? And some people get confused on this, and you can understand that because some say that God dictated it to them and these people wrote them down. Others say, no, no, he inspired the people. His spirit was within the people, and they would write like they would normally write, but they were passing along God's message. And that second case is really what I lean toward because it just makes sense because God had these people working for him and he would give them messages, and we know that from what we've already seen so far. And these messages would vary depending on a couple of things. Now, one of those things is that who was writing it, because obviously, if you have Paul and he's been traveling a lot, then the kind of things he's going to write would be to churches where he's been or to people he's worked with. If you have James, who appears to have stayed around Jerusalem, his focus on what he would write would be much more in the area where he lived and to the Christians there. So that would be different. Also, it would depend on who was receiving the letter, because in some cases, you had a letter that was sent to one person. Okay, so that message is going to be very specific. Other times, it was sent to an entire church, and that church would then pass it along to another church. And one thing I should point out is that um, it was not that easy to get letters around because you had to find someone you could trust to take it. Then copying the letters would take a while. They didn't have copying machines. Every letter, if they were going to make a copy, had to be written down and they'd have to check and then write and then check and then write. So most of the time, people didn't have these letters handy. They had to listen to somebody who read the letter out. So they may be having a church service in, say, Corinth, and someone gets up and says, I got a letter from Paul. And it's, okay, everybody's listening. And this person reads the letter from Paul. And so they would have to be paying attention to be sure that they would understand what was being said and to remember what was said. And I'm sure that there would be cases where they would read it and then read it again, and then might make a copy and send the copy on to another church, and they would keep their own. So I will say that we do not have every letter that was written by someone important in the church. We know that because when Paul was writing to the Corinthians, we have First and Second Corinthians, so we know there are two letters, but he mentions two other letters. So we know there was at least one other that he wrote because he talks about, well, my last letter I was pretty harsh with you, but you needed to hear it. And then there was another one, and it's a little bit less clear whether or not he wrote it or someone was pretending to be Paul and sent it. Now, that brings up a question. How did you know if the letters were good or not? Well, the letters themselves would tell people, okay, be sure you check the scriptures and see that what I'm saying is true. Or they may contain warnings. Here's what somebody's been telling you, but don't believe that because of this. And then they would explain something. So with the letters, we get different messages from them, but the messages fit together. So even though the messages might be different, it just meant what was being talked about. It doesn't mean like they would say, do this in one letter and then change it around and say, do the opposite. No, there was a big warning about that. In fact, in one of those, Paul said, hey, if even an angel shows up and tells you something different from what we told you, don't listen to him. Okay, now that's important. That's the kind of thing that makes you go, okay, I better pay close attention to it. And it would also encourage people to learn the scriptures that they already had. And the scriptures that they already had at that time were the Old Testament, and a lot of references are made to the Old Testament, and the Gospels were just starting to get out. So until a gospel arrived or someone actually visited a church, these letters were very important for teaching the people what to do and what not to do. In some cases, they would be told, wait, I hear that you're doing this. What are you thinking? This isn't what you're supposed to be doing. He said, you'll get in big trouble with this, so you better change your ways. And in other cases, there would be a follow up that said, okay, you're doing well on this part of it, keep it up. So what you had was correction, the discipline part. No one really likes discipline, but sometimes it's necessary. But then there was also the encouragement to say, okay, you're doing very well with this, and I am happy as I could be with you on that. And so it's always good to hear that. It's kind of the same when you have parents or relatives, even teachers who tell you that you're doing a good job. And you go, okay, I can keep doing this. And it makes you feel good and makes it easier. But also, sometimes they'll say, okay, you shouldn't be doing this part. And if it's someone you respect, you pay more attention and you think, okay, I'm going to try harder and avoid these things I shouldn't be doing. And I'll give you, for instance, in this. Now, some people talk about things that people do today, like smoking and doing drugs. And somebody might tell you, oh, that's not in the Bible, so you can do it. So what would you do? Well, you would go into one of the letters that Paul wrote, and you would find that, okay, there's no talking about um, smoking or drugs because those weren't issues for those people back then. They weren't available for them. And you'd say, okay, there's some things about not drinking so much wine that you get drunk, but this is different. So we end up finding, though, in one of Paul's letters that he says to them, do not pollute your body. Oh, now smoking, does that pollute your body? Yeah, it does. Do drugs pollute your body? Mm, they do. So that's a case where you have a lesson that applied back then and it applies now. And what we are taught to do is not to try to see what we can get away with, but we're looking to see how does God want us to live. And really that's what it all comes down to in the letters is the chance for people to learn what they should do, what they should not do, but really the attitude they should have, what they're thinking about at the time. Do you do a good thing just so people will see you do it? Mm, That's not really a good attitude to have. Do you do a good thing whether or not anyone notices? Yes, that's what we're going after. So the people back then, um, for the most part, a lot of them being Gentiles and having not even known about the Old Testament scriptures, really needed the letters because there were a lot of things different from what they were used to. And as they grew in their knowledge, the better they could follow God. And for the most part, the people wanted to do that. They wanted to do what was right. And they also needed to be warned if there were teachers coming in and telling them something different, that they would know how to handle that. All right, I think I've covered the point, but I will finish up with this part because this makes up such a large part of the New Testament. It's good for us to go through the letters from time to time, and it will take a while. And some of these things may not make sense until you get older, but that's okay. Eventually, they will make sense to you. Other things you can read today and go, ah, okay, I can do that. I would suggest that you might start with the book of James. It was the first letter written, as far as we can tell, and it gave some very basic things, and you can learn pretty easily. And from there, you can get into the other ones. All right, I'm going to let you go. And my tie today is one that was celebrating stamps that came out because we don't send letters today without stamps. All right, hope to see you next time, and I'll be looking forward to it. Bye.